All right, let's kick this thing off. So my name is PJ Stevens. I'm one of the marketing managers here at SmartBear Software. We're really thrilled to bring SmartBear and SigmaT together on this really exciting session today on accelerating your microservices testing with DevOps. So before we jump into all the good content and whatnot, I just want to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Chakri Devarakonda. He's the AVP of the Enterprise Solutions Group at SigmaT Technologies. He also joined us at our user conference last September for SmartBear Connect, where he presented on continuous testing and how it's a key ingredient for success in Agile and DevOps. I will be posting that link to his session in the chat box, so you can definitely check that out when you have time after this session. How's it going today, Chakri?
Pretty good. How are you, PJ?
Doing well. Doing well, thank you. Really excited to have you joining us today.
Same here.
Awesome. And so to my left, I have Tamil Sanchez. He's the Solutions Engineering Team Lead here at SmartBear. And he'll be walking us through some slides and also giving a demo on how SmartBear's tools can fit in with testing microservices. So with that, let's take a look at the agenda today, and I'll let Chakri kind of walk us through that.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, PJ. Good morning, everyone. This is Chakri Devarakonda. So primarily, the whole objective of this particular webinar is to give you an overview of microservices architecture, what are the challenges and solutions to it, and how does SigmaT test out of it, and what is the importance of APIs in it, how do we build an automation framework around it, and what are the different tools in the SmartBear stack for allowing us to test the microservices point of view. And at the same point of time, what do we do at SigmaT from a DevOps testing approach? So I would start off with the DevOps testing approach in terms of from a SigmaT standpoint, and we would go on with how a couple of organizations have built the microservices architecture and help them accelerate their whole organization story in terms of it. And at the same point of time, if you look at it, how monolithic architectures have been moved out and how microservices have helped in bolstering the whole DevOps perspective. So that's on a pretty high level. Tamil will present on the tool stack from SmartBear, which would help in the automation performance part of it from a microservices angle.
That's right.
So if you can go to the next.
Sure.
Yeah.
So just to piggyback off that, we will definitely see a lot of how SmartBear tooling will support microservices architecture and how flexible our products are when it comes to automating anything that you build when it comes to performance or functional testing, and again supporting the backbone of microservices with service virtualization. So Chakri, now I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide, and we could start get the show on the road.
Sure. Yeah. Just to give you a high-level overview of what we do at SigmaT. SigmaT is the world's largest independent pure-play testing services organization. We've been primarily in business for the last 20 years, and our motto has been to serve quality. And for the past 5 years, we have been more into the quality engineering side of it. When you look at it as a key offerings point of view from a QA enablement services, as organizations have moved from waterfall to agile to a DevOps, and as they have moved from a giant monolithic architecture application systems to a small, more testable and independent services with the help of microservices, how they've done. So every activity in that particular perspective becomes an engineering activity, and quality at that point of time is pretty important. And when you look at it from a delivery pipeline view, right from a build integrate, deploy, to operate aspect of it, testing has been to be continuous all over through this. Not specifically related to anymore after you build and develop, you would test, but while you are building and while you are integrating and while you are deploying, there is a continuous testing associated with it, and how that continuous testing comes into picture in terms of it. The most important part of it, at any aspect of it you look at it, test automation is pretty important, either from a functional standpoint of view or a non-functional standpoint of view. And when you look at that aspect of it, at each stage, what are those enablement services if you want to look, if you want to have a perspective to it. So component testing services and microservices and APIs testing is more involved in terms of it from an automation, and you would have 100% automation. Tamil, what is your perspective from SmartBear aspect of it, from a tooling, and how do you see how organizations have picked up the component testing services and the microservices part of it?
Yeah, so one thing that I've seen, right, as a best practice in the industry when it comes to microservices, just like microservices are broken down into tiny functions, you should also break down your frameworks, your testing frameworks into smaller functions and make them cross-usable. And this is something that SmartBear tooling excels at, not because we have specific functionality that does this, but because we're flexible and we give you the capability of reusing scripts over and over all of your tooling. And we integrate with things like version control systems, again, to make the frameworks and the tests shareable. We also fit into automation pipeline, whether you're using Jenkins or Bamboo, or you have a completely different approach. And that's because, again, the tooling can be called upon via command line parameters that, again, gives you the flexibility to just easily, push them into your current process. Okay. When thinking also about microservices and how you build out your frameworks, it's really important to have a top-down approach, right? To be able to look at the bigger picture and the reusability of the pieces of the framework that you're building. And that's, from a functional testing standpoint. That's also from a performance testing standpoint, or even from a security testing standpoint. And at the end of the day, right, you won't always have these services available to you, right? Your microservices, you need to do some integration testing, for example, and we'll cover more about that a little bit later. But also being able to, on the fly, stand up a virtual or a mocked version of an API that may not necessarily be available at a particular time is really important, right? So that your process, your workflows are not bottlenecked, are not stopped. And that feeds all into the whole agile methodology as well. Does that make sense, Chakri? Anything else that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, that's perfectly makes sense in terms of when you look at it. All of these are pretty important in terms of testing them, right? Not only from a functional standpoint, but also from a non-functional standpoint, as you did say. And APIs and microservices are key. And the whole aspect of it is that since they are individual services and they can be automated to 100%, not as the UI layer where you might not have 100% automation, but you do have, there is a lot of maintenance. However, when you look at it from this aspect of it, the 100% of automation really brings into the table a lot of aspects to it. And at the same point of time, when you see in further in terms of all the different services, service virtualization is one of the key aspects of it. When you look at not only testing, because you're testing all these microservices on an individual basis, and at the same point of time, when you get into a publish subscribe mode and you want to do an integration service, mocking and stopping is good, but at the same point of time, to do an end-to-end automation, service virtualization is one of the key aspects which would really help you out in getting into that. So what's your take on it, Tamil, from what do you see on a service virtualization aspect of it?
Right. So that's a very good question, Chakri. And what you guys need to keep in mind is that maintenance, and accountabilities for this new thing, right? This new virtual serviceization thing that now needs to be created and maintained. It becomes the overhead, right? So I've seen in the past users struggling with having to build these virtual assets and maintain them, and then allocate resources to do that. And it takes away from the whole microservices services standpoint. And where I'm going with this is that we need rigid products. We need rigid tools that require very little maintenance, that don't require a whole bunch of scripting or coding to stand up. And that's where SmartBear comes in, right? SmartBear provides an easy to use platform that allows you to virtualize an API by simply, or a service, right, by simply providing a definition or navigating over the real service. And again, maintenance is super simple. And that will help you along the way, not only at the beginning stages, but also going forward, because again, you won't need to provide that level of resource, and you could focus on the actual core of your microservices.
Yeah, sounds good. Perfect. That's pretty pretty necessary in terms of it. And from a monitoring aspect of it, when you look at it, when it is being deployed and operated, what kind of aspects do you like everybody to look at?
Right. So at the end of the day, right, we provide these microservices to feed on other platforms, to feed on multiple platforms. And you want to make sure that those production environments are continuously working, right? Depending on the purpose of the microservice itself, you may be directly influencing revenue on your organization. And if for example these microservices are not properly managed, they're not properly monitored, then you may lose some business in case that something isn't working as it's supposed to in the production environment. Again, SmartBear has a whole stack of products that integrate with each other, including a monitoring solution that can actually leverage existing test cases that are pre-built with SoapUI Pro and SoapUI open source, so that you're continuously monitoring these services. And if something does happen, you will know before any of your clients, notify you with. So it's very, very important to continuously monitor, again, your microservices, so that you know when it's down, versus your customers calling you and saying, hey, I need to move to a different solution or a different services because you guys aren't working out for me.
Right, true.
Chakri, so I see a question on the chat. I'm going to go ahead and read it out loud. And again, guys, if anybody has any questions about anything that we're talking about, feel free to submit them in the Q&A box on Zoom. We want this to be interactive. We want to hear from you. This is definitely things that we've experienced, right, that we've seen, that we apply in the industry, and we want to make sure that everything makes sense. So if anybody has questions, please feel free to bring them on. So first question I see here: by virtualizing, you mean mocking services, or is there more to it? So yes, it is mocking, but it's a more advanced way of mocking. It's actually building a mock service that will be intelligent, that will return a particular response given a particular request. Okay, so it's actually something a little more realistic, and we'll be able to see that in action a little bit later. Magesh has another question. It says, what are the challenges we have in migrating the existing application into microservices? What are the things we should have in mind? So that's a broad question, Magesh, and different organizations definitely take different approaches to this. Again, as Chakra was mentioning, having a monolithic approach to your services allow little room for you to expand, right? And with microservices, yes, it's a huge leap, but what I see clients doing is actually breaking down the service piece by piece, right? Not all at once, depending again on the organization and the industry that you're providing the service for. But again, breaking it down piece by piece, and then subjecting it to separate release cycles and development cycles and so on and so forth. Chakri, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, what you said is pretty true, Thamil, in terms of when you look at it, it is on an industry and an application based to it. But when you look at it from a steps or a kind of way you want to migrate an app onto a microservices, the biggest part of it would be the data on a live application, which would be a challenging one because the legacy app to the new microservice does take a lot of bit of hit because it's dependent on what's your situation and how do you want to look at it, whether you want to use a temporary API or write code for the existing set of data or use it, because primarily when you look at it, the microservices, most of it you would go in terms of a NoSQL or a data which is more of a big data kind of thing. So at that point of time, your structured data to an unstructured data moving and any kind of most of the time the modernization of the applications happen because either you would have a code which is completely dead and you do not want to reuse it, especially from the UI standpoint of view. But when you want to split all of these, then it becomes a little difficult in terms of it. So that's how it depends on a case-to-case basis, and things have to be done.
Right. I see another question here specific to SoapUI. It says, can you share details on how to integrate CI/CD testing with Bamboo and SoapUI test cases? I will cover that a little bit later. So stick around for the high-level demonstration of the Ready API platform, and we'll talk about how you can automate with SoapUI Pro. Next question, can we do DevOps testing with SoapUI open source tooling? The answer to that is a vague yes. And the answer to that is because, again, the tool is flexible. You can submit the execution of these tests on the fly. And that's how we see. We don't integrate with existing tools or the common framework languages like Cucumber or things like that directly. So we don't accept feature files pre-existing or, again, that specific syntax. But we have reusable assets that can be pushed on as part of the automated pipeline within your organization, and that's what we consider, the integrations with the DevOps world. And we'll definitely see some more of that a little bit later. So I'm going to answer a couple of more questions because I know Chakri has a couple of stories that will be very beneficial to all the audience here. So I'll answer two more questions and then we'll move on. So somebody asked difference between API testing and I assume it says microservices. So truthfully speaking, it's at the very base, it's the very same, right? It's just a different practice. In your API testing or in the microservice testing, what you do is you would break down the testing framework into parts as well. And with tools like SoapUI, it allows you to stand up reusable assets across all of your tests, so that you're not, doing these tests over and over for different services, but you're reusing your assets across, your whole framework. Okay, so hopefully that answers that question. And one more. Let's see. What is the best way to automate a functional use case when a microservice response is asynchronous? That's a very good question. And SoapUI Pro has specific features for that, right? So obviously with an asynchronous call, you send a request expecting something back, but you may receive an okay, I received your request, something is happening behind the scenes and you'll get the real response sometime down the line. So our tools do have native features that will support this, okay? You can have it wait for a particular response on an endpoint, and it'll open up a listener basically, and once that real response comes back, it'll continue with the rest of the steps. Or there's things that you could look out for, like files or property values or a number of other things to be present within the the environment. And once that piece is present, it will continue on with the rest of the steps. Again, I'm more than happy to show that a little bit later. Right now, we are going to continue on with the demonstration. Chakri, is there anything else before we move on to the next slide that you want to add?
Yeah, pretty much covered. We can move to the next slide and keep going.
All right.
So
listen about this Amazon story.
Yeah, so primarily in terms of it, when we look at it, how a lot of organizations have moved to the DevOps side of it, and how they have been able to implement it. Two stories, Amazon and Netflix, they moved from the monolithic to the service-oriented architecture. And Amazon, if you look at it, one of their biggest ones, they've done all of these automated in terms of it, and from AWS code deploy, pipeline, and code commit, all of these from a source code to the cloud, how they did the release automation and automated deployment in terms of with no downtime at all in terms of what it is. The whole aspect of it is that they've created a small teams and made sure that all of those are being attacked and created a single purpose service where they can talk to each other. And the highly decoupled architecture had helped them out, building it out, self-service and to technology agnostic tools. So that made them completely move towards from a typical large application to a smaller scale applications. And they were able to do it in the code deployments at every 11.6 seconds on an average. So that has accelerated them in terms of doing it. While we move to the next slide, Netflix, one of the best implementer of microservices, and they've not only tested in terms of from a functional standpoint, but also from a non-functional performance and security and resiliency standpoint, how something will work if something fails. The most important part of it in microservices architecture, when you look at it, it is primarily driven in terms of independent services, and each of them would be dependent for information and getting integrated to it. So at that point of time, what happens if one fails? That's where their whole aspect of chaos monkey testing has come into picture, where if something is being removed out of their total services, one of the microservices fails, how resilient it is and how they would be able to recover, and what is their mean time to recover in terms of it. So that is where what they have done in terms of it, and specifically put it across different containers. One of the most important part of it is that when you look at it, services, microservices, when you package it and put it in containers, it will be much more easier to interact and build it. And the most aspect of it is that when you want to look at it from your path of maturity towards DevOps, a continuous testing and continuous monitoring aspect of it, you need to have an immutable server. What does that mean is that previously in operations, we used to rebuild the server and kind of do it, but add something to the patch to it and then again test and then see what it is. But immutable servers are more about like you scrap the whole thing, get up a new one because it's much more easier, and you get the new one with the newest release and patch to it. So that way your issue with the operation standpoint of it is being taken care of. So that's in terms of the story of Netflix and Amazon to it. When we move to the next slide. So typically, a lot of ways you look at it, how microservices architecture is built upon in terms of when you look at it, you would need to look from an aspect of independent services, and all of these are talking through REST APIs in terms of from an API gateway. So what are the different types of testing you need to look at is the unit testing part of it, which is pretty simple. You're testing the service independently aspect of it. Whereas when you look at it from an integration testing, all of these do work in a publish subscriber mode, and when you want to validate the integrations, interactions between each of those layers, different layers, whether it is data store, cache, or external components, all this has to be integrated. So testing of it has to be done. And at the same point of time, when you look at it, there are other aspects of it as component testing and contract testing. When you seeing how these components, when they behave in independent fashion, how they do test on it, and what is the contract testing in terms of it, what are the different types of tools in it, and how the contract is a pattern that drives the development of the provider from its consumer's point of view. So the biggest point of view in a microservices architecture is how it is being consumed. When you look at it, what kind of tools would be work for it, and what is that? What are those contracts being satisfied? So that's where it is more about. So when you look at it, contract, you're talking about what is that? How each of these services can be consumed from a different packs, and at the same point of time, how are they being implemented from a consumer standpoint? So you have a subscriber publisher mode of it, and at the same point of time, how this particular service is consumed is what you look at it from that aspect of it. Tamil, you would like to look from a tooling perspective, what would be the best ways of it? From what would be the tools on these different types of testing?
Yes, definitely. So again, this goes back, right? You're mentioning, let's see, 5 different components when it comes to microservice testing, right? And I have to reiterate this because it's one of the most important things, and it's a reusability of the assets that you're building. Okay, so when you're unit testing, when you're integrating testing, when you're doing component testing or contract testing, you're still hitting the same microservices, right? So imagine having to create frameworks individually for all these different assets. That's where our tooling comes in. Okay, you import your microservices as a whole. You have them in one central location, and then you could pick and choose the scenarios that you want to build upon. Okay, so that's where you would see the majority of the benefit is a reusability, and in the same platform you could also virtualize. So when we talk about end-to-end testing or integration testing, okay, some of these microservice components may not be available. Maybe microservices as a whole may not be available. So it does become important to also virtualize the services so that you don't have to wait until it's really up and running for you to run your tests or you to develop your consuming part, right? Or if you want to provide a sample to your microservice consumers, you could also do that as well. Contract testing, right, is simply validating that your microservice responses, that they're actually giving you what the contract says, right? So in the past we've called these types of tests schema compliance validation points or something similar to that. We have built-in features that will allow you to assign these validation points. Say, hey, this microservice should respond back with the same schema as I have on this contract, on this WSDL definition, or on this Swagger definition, right? And these are all functionalities that we have right out of the box. And at the end of the day, you package all this together, and you would be able to feed that to a pipeline, okay? And again, we will see that in the demonstration to some degree, and I'm more than happy to answer any other questions that may come up, during the demonstration or during this webinar.
Sure. So when we go to the next slide, so typically in terms of when you see it, we did talk about how each of these will work and how the consumer-driven contract testing and how the integration testing point of view comes into picture. So primarily, it is more about what is the provider, and the provider, you do the unit level testing, but when you are providing something to the consumer and you're getting integrated with different kinds of services, which might be a third-party service or internal service or an external service, either you can do a mocking, which is typically done mocking or stubbing at a level, at a unit level, where you get an answer, a response as a yes or no. But when you look at it from a service virtualization standpoint, it is much more than that, because you are trying to test even the positive and the negative scenarios of it. So that way you would be able to expect what happens if something goes wrong and what is being done if you do not have the consumer part of it or a particular service, external service to it. So integration testing in terms of that aspect of it has to be taken care, whereas in a consumer-driven contract testing, it is more about what is that specific data or a service which is being consumed, and what are the contract copy to it, and how is that being interactive perspective, interaction perspective for it. So Tamil, you can look at from a tool perspective and also from a service virtualization, how this would really help them out in terms of testing all of these aspects to it. So maybe I'll hand it over to you to get to the demonstration and different kinds of tools which would really help the individuals and also the attendees in terms of what kind of tools would be beneficial from a microservices standpoint.
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is the time where, I give you a high level, introduction to SmartBear Portfolio when it comes to microservices testing. So here we have 3 different solutions, right? We have SoapUI Pro. We all know SoapUI is an open source product. We do have a commercial offering that provides a lot more. That's what we're going to demonstrate today. Along that, we have LoadUI Pro for performance testing, and Service V for service virtualization or advanced mocking, right? That term is still a little slow to catch on to a lot of the industry. But service virtualization is basically advanced mocking. And it's all encapsulated under one platform called Ready API. Okay, so this makes it easy for you to easily transition from functional testing to performance testing to even virtualization, reusing your assets. They all live under the same roof. And again, you'll be able to see it a little more visibly once I get into the demonstration. Below that, we see some of the things that we support, and this is only a very small amount. I'm sure you guys use all sorts of different protocols, all sorts of different industry standards, right? We should fit right in the middle. We are the de facto standard when it comes to API testing and whatnot. And if that's not enough, SmartBear is also behind Swagger Initiative, right? We acquired the company that built out Swagger a couple years ago, and we donated it to the Open API Initiative to make sure that that it's not just our ideology, but it's intended for industry use, right? For the industry's benefit. Okay, so obviously there's more companies backing the Open API or the Swagger specification or the Open API specification, as they now call it today, right? So companies like IBM, Microsoft, Google, we're all behind this to make sure that it's a rigid standard. In accordance to that, we integrate with the most common type of API gateways, which are a very common way to host and provide our microservices today. It just makes it easy to manage. And basically with our products, we can easily connect to these API gateways and start pulling the microservices in so that we can start testing them, building frameworks, and so on and so forth. And finally, at the end here, we see some integrations with a lot of tools used in development, right? Jira, Jenkins for automation, GitHub, repository system, and Test Complete's in there because we also integrate with front-end testing, which is another product. These are just samples, okay? We do integrate with the majority of tools for repository, for automation, for issue tracking, and so on and so forth. Now, SoapUI Pro specifically, again, it's been in the industry for over a decade now. It does not only support SOAP services, for those of you that are still not very familiar with it, it's a very strong presence in the REST, JMS, and other protocols. Again, and the idea behind SoapUI Pro is that we make it very seamless to build the frameworks, to build your test, whether they're unit, integration, end-to-end tests, and you could, again, reuse these components, and then at the end of the day, you can run them as automation pipelines, okay? So that you don't necessarily have to have a development resource building your frameworks, right? You have somebody, a tester, easily building out the required frameworks by using our products, and then pass it on to the ops team for automation. And we'll see more about that a little bit later, and what I really mean with all the out-of-the-box functionality. SoapUI Pro is one of the only API-specific performance testing tools out there. Okay, there are some others, but our hugest benefit is, again, reusability. You build an end-to-end test case in SoapUI with the right click of a button. You can turn it into a performance test. You could turn it into a regression performance test that will run after every single build with the same features that we talked about in SoapUI Pro. We have really easy to manipulate statistics stacks. So if you need particular statistics, even if you have an end-to-end workflow that you're running as a load test, you could say, hey, I want API C statistics, and I only want to see the time taken at an average, at the max, min, all the common types of statistics. Now, if you're looking to expand performance testing, obviously you will need to distribute, use the cloud, or use your infrastructure. We have very easy ways to do this within SoapUI Pro as well. And last but not least, monitoring. Right? When you're putting stress on APIs depend on hardware. You want to be able to monitor that, or maybe they depend on databases or other things. And this is out-of-the-box features that SoapUI Pro has as well. Okay. Service V is our third tool and last tool that I will show today. Service V allows you to virtualize an API. Again, you could do it off of a definition. You could do it off of recording capabilities, or you could do it off of scratch. Maybe you just have a JSON response, like somebody mentioned earlier in the chat. If that's what you have, that's all you need to virtualize. You don't require any, development effort, any development resource. But you can also run this as part of your IDEs and as part of your continuous integration frameworks, which again is a plus, right? Don't want to spend too much time on this. I know you guys are probably bored of slides, so why don't we just go ahead and jump into the actual products and show you where we're really coming from. Okay, so this is a Ready API platform, and once again, it consists of 4 different solutions. SoapUI, Secure, SoapUI, and Service V. We didn't talk too much about Secure, but that's included with SoapUI Pro, and I will talk about it at a high level. The first thing you want to do when you go into the Ready API platform is import your APIs, and there's a bunch of different ways that you could actually do that. I usually like to go back to the dashboard if I'm a brand new user. Okay, dashboard will give you high-level stats of all the tests and everything that you built within SoapUI. But again, let's say that we're new users that we need to get up and running really quickly. We have wizards here on the left-hand side that will do most of the work for you, okay? So if you have an API definition, whether that's a WSDL, a Swagger definition, open API specification, a RAML file, includes, all the common types of use cases, definitions in the industry, okay? You can easily start from that, and we will automatically generate a test case with all the sample requests from that definition file. In a lot of cases, we don't have definition files, unfortunately. And if that's your particular use case, you can simply add the endpoints and validate that that you have the right method associated with it. And then you could start with that. And last but not least, you could start from scratch. But even this will open up the door to a couple of other things that are really powerful. One of them is recording. Okay, so if you have an empty project or if you have an existing project with APIs, you can right-click on it, use our discovery feature, and this will open up a sample browser that will allow you to navigate, to whatever front-end tool is consuming the API or whatever client you would like to use to interact with your microservice. So let's say swagger.io. Again, you start seeing these interactions, 17. And this is actually a documentation page for an API, but you can just start interacting with it directly from here. Let's say we send a specific payload with webinar pet. Say execute this, and you can see that my recording requests are increasing. When you're done, you click on done, and you just choose a particular API calls that you want to add to your project. This will make it reusable, and again, I'll talk about that in a few seconds. So let's say I'm picking my JSON responses and my Swagger responses, generate services, and this will allow me to immediately create a load test or create just functional tests off of this. Okay, now there are other ways to start importing your APIs, but the important piece here is that you have imported your APIs, and regardless of how you did it, again, with definitions, with URLs, by discovering the APIs, this is your endpoint. This is your end goal. And all of these interfaces that you see here, they're different APIs that are imported into my tool, and now I can start building my tests on top of them. Okay, so I could start saying, you know what, this Google Maps API, let's go ahead and add this request to a test case so that we can start building those unit tests for this particular microservice. The same goes if you're trying to build an end-to-end test and so on and so forth. And we'll see more about that in a few seconds. Now, again, the importance of the projects piece, it's still very, very important, right? Because this is where you would go back and update your microservices, okay? In the software world, things change really iteratively. You want to make sure that you can update all of the tests, in that same manner, right? So you don't want to have 100 tests for your 1,000 or so microservices and then have to go back and update every endpoint. You want to be able to go back and have this tool or have any tool that you're using easily do that via out-of-the-box functions, okay? So we have a refactor definition option that will basically allow you to provide the new contract, okay? And this will update your existing test with all either new microservice calls or new microservice endpoints and so on and so forth. Maybe there's a change to existing parameters within a microservice. This will update all of that within your tests. Really powerful. All right, back to testing, guys. When building end-to-end tests, you can start building test cases, right? I usually, recommend using very good naming convention for test cases, depending on what type of test it's going to be. That way it's descriptive and you don't get lost, when you have so many microservices and so many tests. We also, so that will move you over to SoapUI Pro, okay? And let's say you want to build an end-to-end test case in this case. So for, let's say I have login, search, and by logout, which I've already pre-loaded in here to make sure that we could follow along the demonstration. And normally when you're dealing with integration tests, this means that these microservices should return information that may need to be passed down to subsequent requests, right? So in this case, I submitted a login request. I returned the session ID 1976, and if I run logout, 1976 is automatically passed because we have features that will set syntaxes automatically without you having to know about it with a simple right-click, get data, and just pointing to that particular value that you wanted to pull in. You apply this once, and it will always apply the most recent value in that particular element. Okay, so if I run this right now, it'll pick up the same session. If I run it one more time, 939, it should run something a little different, 939. All right, so that's the integration testing piece. You can also reuse these test cases in case that you want to, not have to worry about building this sequence of steps every single time you want to test a different part of a microservice or a different microservice that may use these interactions. So we have something called, we have a test step called run test case, which basically modularizes this test case and it allows you to easily run it within any other scenario. So that's something that's very important, okay? All right, so next comes validation. We want to make sure we validate these responses. And something that's really powerful, really important in the microservices place is contract testing, right? We've all heard of that if you're dealing with microservices. And it's actually applied very easily, okay? So each of these test steps have assertions at the bottom, which basically are simple validation points. I'm going to enable them. We have over 30 different types of assertions that will validate different things, including contract testing. Okay, so if I go into compliance status and standards, category here in my set, I could look down and I'll see that I have a schema compliance, and this is specific to a WSDL or a WADL. And then we have Swagger compliance, again, for those of you that have Swagger contracts. And then last but not least, we also have a JSON schema compliance contract. Here it is. That will allow you to point to a JSON schema file and always validate the responses against these entities. Okay. Now, assertions work the same way, regardless of what you're validating, So basically, if you have, your particular validation points enabled, and then something doesn't work, accordingly, you will receive a flag that says, hey, you know what, this doesn't work as per you intended it to work, right? So if I run my whole sequence of steps, right, I got a couple of failures. I know and understand that my search by logout don't work as I expected them to work because my validation points were not met, okay? And from here comes the automation portion of it, right? You don't want to come into a tool. You want to be able to push that into your DevOps world. You want to be able to push this as a continuous testing purpose, or whatever your automation thought process is currently. You can easily incorporate these tests by running them from the command line. Okay. We have a set of command line parameters that will allow you to pick and choose what you want to execute, and from there you will receive, particular results. So the results that you will get will come in a couple of different formats, either printable, JUnit style for those of you that use things like Bamboo or Jenkins or other frameworks that consume these reports, and also raw data reports for those of you that are using application lifecycle management tools and want to consume them, in that phase. Okay. Now, really quickly, right, because we are running out of time, I want to show you high level type of information that we provide. It's a lot of details, right, to make sure that it suffices the user needs. So if something didn't work as you expect, you will get, failures and exactly why it failed. If it was a contract failure, you would see, hey, according to the contract, your microservice is not responding with the right schema. Okay, and then at the end, you will be able to see the actual physical request and response that was sent, so that you can validate these things, or your developers can validate these things and go back and do the needful to fix them. Okay. Again, I mentioned that we can run this from the command line. We also have a wizard here, launch test runner. This is a wizard that will basically build out the command line arguments for you, so you don't have to worry about that. You can just copy the command line arguments from here and put them in Jenkins and put them in Bamboo or whatever frameworks you're using to automate. Okay. Now, this wizard, just consists of different entities where you just say, hey, this is what I want for my automation scripts, and then that's what the command line parameters will have. Right, so it's very similar across the board for security and performance testing. But let's say that you're starting from scratch, you have no performance tests, you have no security tests. You can actually right-click on your existing functional test, and then choose create a new security test off of this, or create a new load test off of this. And this will actually take the same exact scenario, move you over to the specific tool, and then you can build that particular performance test that you're looking for. Okay, so we obviously have the most common types of performance load profiles that are used. You can create your own if you don't find exactly what you need. I'm going to make this really simple. I'm just going to leave it at fixed for 15 seconds just for the sake of time. And then this will iteratively just run these specific scenario 5 times, at the same time. Wait a second, and then do it again for the length of 15 seconds. Okay. Now, again, there's different types of performance tests out there. There's different types of load tests. The important part is that you build it out very easily here, and then you can automate it the same way we automated the functional test via the command line, via our wizards. If you are using the user interface, right, reports are really important, statistics are really important, and they will allow you to dive directly onto your particular API calls and select what type of statistics you want back, right? So I mentioned earlier, buy is bringing in the revenue. This service call is what's actually, what we need to make sure that it works well and scales well so that we can accept the payments from our users. And here you can easily see, different sets of metrics and get them back. We also have a bunch of other features here that will allow you to compare and contrast from, different versions of the microservices and compare them against different microservices and so on and so forth. I also mentioned distribution earlier. Again, it's super simple to add here. You can add as many agents as you want to distribute your performance tests. And monitoring will allow you to add application server monitors so that you can understand if the resources that are provided to your microservices are actually enough to support the consumption. Okay. So hopefully that made sense. I know I went there a little quickly and it's really high level because just for the sake of time, but Service V is also a key part of the microservices world. Okay, you need to virtualize when it comes to you doing integration tests. You need to virtualize sometimes when doing end-to-end tests. We need to virtualize when the microservices are not available and development or the front-end developers need to consume this particular API, right? You need to be able to test these things priorhand. And last but not least, if you want your consumers to have like a taste of what the service is going to do, this is also a great way to do it. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a bunch of different ways that you could actually start building these virtual assets, okay? And that's very similar to what we saw on the functional testing side, either a definition, right? WSDL, WADL, Swagger, OpenAPI. You don't see any more options here, but we have plugins for other things like RAML, API Blueprint, right? Other definitions in the industry, but these are the most common ones, so that's what you see here. Again, we support others. You can expose them by installing their plugins here. Recording. If the API exists, you can navigate over it via our client, and then that's it. You capture those responses. We also have a feature that will allow you to turn on virtual routing capability, which will reroute from the virtual asset to the real API and capture the response on the way back. That makes it very easy to maintain and update these virtual assets. Okay. And last but not least, you create your responses from scratch. Let's start there. Right? Let's give this example because it's the hardest way to do it, and it's really, really not hard at all. Right. So let's say we have a get method that would get, let's say, an animal. Right. Really simple. Right. All right, so create resource, right? Get animal, have no responses in there. So let's start creating responses. These responses are initially empty. You can pull them again from a definition. You can pull them from databases and external files. But I'm going, the hardest way that we have here to create a service. Let's say that this animal, it's a very simple response, is going to be SmartBear. Right, in XML. Maybe the second response is going to have something else in JSON. Let's say the same thing, right? SmartBear. Oh, I did it backwards actually. SmartBear here, and then animal is here. And then last but not least, we'll just have a catch-all at the end here that it says message error. So that's really all it takes. Okay, so anybody can do this, right? Anybody can create this virtual asset without having to go out of their way to create scripts or things like that. And just to show you that this virtual asset is actually live, right? Let's go ahead and go into localhost port 8080, I believe it's in, and then I think it's get animal, enter, we get our response. Okay, we hit it again, we got our second response, we hit it again, we got our third response. But again, we don't want to stop here. We want to make these integration tests realistic, and you want to be able to manipulate these responses, right, without having to manually going into the tool and changing the response. So you can also make these dynamic. We have different dispatch strategies that will easily allow you to make them really, really intelligent. We have different options, but for the sake of time, I'm going to use parameter. And let's say there's a format query parameter that could be different, types. But I'm going to say query and say if the response is JSON, return response to. If the format parameter is XML, then return response 1. And for everything else, return my error message. Okay, so now I have a real life, API, believe it or not, right? If I hit enter here, I'm going to get error because it's expecting a query in there. Okay, so if I add my query, format equals JSON, I get back my JSON response. And if I say format equals XML, I get my XML response. Okay, so we see how we went from 0 to nothing really quickly. And for the microservices environment, you can manipulate these existing virtual assets from the command line, just like we did in SoapUI or in LoadUI. You can say, hey, I'm going to need, this is part of my end-to-end test in this part of the pipeline. Let's go ahead and stand one up. And again, this isn't a manual process. This is a one-time setup via the command line, and you will be able to deploy, run a virtual asset, execute all the tests, all the integration tests that will depend on APIs that are not available against a Vert or virtual API. I call Vert for short. And then shut it down, right? You don't want to have to continuously run it. Maybe it's in a Docker container, maybe it's in somewhere in the cloud where it may recur some charge. So you want to be able to take it down. You could easily do that from an automation standpoint. And this was a very light demonstration of the end-to-end products, but just keep in mind that the reusability is an important part, right? We've seen in our projects how I moved and built test cases in SoapUI. You can also start adding, virtual assets directly from here. Add to Vert. You can create a brand new virtual API off of this Google Maps API and start building on the responses. Okay. So hopefully everybody had a lot of takeaway here. I see a lot of questions popping up, so I'm going to take these last couple of minutes here to answer as many questions as we can. And Chakri, any other comments here of what you've seen within the product or how you implement these things?
Yeah, this is a comprehensive suite of tool set, and primarily, as you did say, it's a high-level part of it, and implementing them on a step-by-step basis, and what are the different components to it. I see a lot of questions being put across on how do you do it and what do you do it. So we've covered a lot of ground, and maybe we'll take a couple of questions and answer rest of them what are left around in terms of it with them.
Awesome. Thank you, Chakri. Yeah, so let's take a couple of minutes here to answer some questions. I know that we're up on the hours, but if anybody's willing to stay on for a couple more minutes, I'm definitely open to answering a couple more questions. Some of them will be through the chat, and some of them will be out loud.
Cool. So yeah, I see a bunch of questions. So a lot of questions around free trials of the software. You can definitely check that out at smartbear.com. And I'll post a link in the chat box as well. Tamil, I know you're going through these questions. Is there anything that kind of catches your eye as a general theme? I know we've really appreciate everyone for their engagement in this session.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of great questions. And again, guys, hopefully this isn't the last time that you have to reach out to us. If your questions go unanswered, please reach out to we have a huge community. You could reach out to us directly. I believe we have Twitter and all that fun stuff as well. So definitely, hashtag at SmartBear, and we will definitely, look for those questions.
Totally.
So really quickly, I see a question here. Does Ready API have any feature to generate test reports during the build? 100%. So again, we support, it's a little different depending on what product you're using, but let's take SoapUI Pro, for example, provides JUnit style reports, provides raw data reports in XML or CSV so that you could do, whatever you'd like with that data or integrate it with other tools. And we also have a printable view. And yes, you can execute it or run these reports as part of your automation pipeline. It's a command line parameter. It's really simple to set up, and the product sets it up for you as well. And as soon as it runs a test, it will generate that report for you. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see what else we have. So somebody's asking, how can I add customized security headers? Like, it seems like there was one example here. So there's a couple of different ways for SOAP services. It should be done through WSS configuration. If it's following WSS standards, we have an out-of-the-box features that will give you the guidelines and will add these headers to your SOAP message automatically. If you're talking about the RESTful side of things, we have REST parameters, which can be added by, within the project section, within the screen plus sign. See sample parameter, okay, and then change the style to header. Okay, when we see this here, this might not work right now, but that's fine. We will be able to see that header within here. And if you're talking about really standard authorization or authentication types in the RESTful world, we also have this auth manager, which you will see supports the most common types of authorization in the industry. So basic, OAuth 2.0, 1.0, AWS signature, and a couple of others that you see here. Hopefully that made sense. Last question for the day. Can we run Ready API tests from Jenkins? 100%. I actually had a little example that I wanted to show. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. But the truth is that it's as simple as taking that command line parameter that I showed you how to get earlier and posting it on a build process. Okay, Jenkins can point to a directory or to a repository system to pull the project, run the build with the command line parameters executing these SoapUI or Ready API tests, and then it will generate a report for you. So if that doesn't, if you want more examples or anything like that, again, feel free to reach out to us directly.
Absolutely. So I just want to give a really huge thank you to Chakri and SigmaT Technologies for partnering with us on this session. I thought it was really insightful, and I thought we had a great back and forth with Chakri and Tamil. So thank you both for your time today. Definitely do check out SigmaT at sigmaT.com for any testing services that you might need. Also, SmartBear.com, you can check out any of the tools that Tamil demoed today with a free trial. So to all of you who sat through an hour-long session today, we also really appreciate your time. So please stay tuned for the recording, which we'll send out via email later this week. You can probably expect that tomorrow in your inbox. So thanks everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everybody. You guys have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chakri.
Thank you, everyone.